November 1942. A Chinese peasant walks through a Japanese checkpoint in occupied China. He carries nothing suspicious, just a worn cloth sack filled with flour. The Japanese soldier waves him through without a second glance. The peasant bows, shuffles forward and disappears into the crowded street. 3 days later, a Japanese military train carrying ammunition explodes on a bridge 60 miles south. The locomotive tumbles into the river below, taking 200 tons of supplies meant for the front lines. The Japanese never find the bomb. They never identify the saboteur. They never suspect the flour. That sack contained what would become one of the most ingenious weapons of the entire war. It looked exactly like baking flour because it was baking flour mixed with one of the most powerful explosives ever created. The Americans called it Aunt Jemima, after the famous pancake mix. It could be baked into bread. It could be cooked into muffins. It could pass through any checkpoint, survive any inspection, and fool any guard. And when detonated, it could blow a steel bridge into the sky. This is the story of how American scientists turned breakfast into a weapon of war and how Chinese guerrillas used it to fight one of the most successful sabotage campaigns in military history. The problem facing American intelligence in 1942 was deceptively simple, but nearly impossible to solve. The Office of Strategic Services, known as the OSS, had been tasked with supporting Chinese resistance fighters against the Japanese occupation. Guerrilla forces were operating throughout the country, eager to sabotage Japanese supply lines. But there was one critical obstacle that threatened to make the entire effort useless. Getting explosives past Japanese checkpoints was essentially impossible. The Japanese controlled the major cities, the ports, and most importantly, the railways. Their inspection teams searched everything. Conventional explosives like dynamite or TNT were immediately recognizable. Plastic explosives were too new and too scarce. Even if guerrillas managed to smuggle small quantities past the guards, the amounts were never enough to cause significant damage to hardened military targets. What the OSS needed was something that had never existed before. An explosive that could be transported in plain sight, an explosive that could pass visual inspection, an explosive that could withstand physical examination, and ideally, an explosive that could prove itself harmless if a suspicious guard demanded a demonstration. The specification seemed like fantasy. How could any substance be both powerful enough to destroy a bridge and innocent enough to fool trained inspectors? How could something explode with tremendous force yet remain stable enough to cook and eat? The laws of chemistry did not seem to permit such a contradiction. The challenge was made more urgent by the strategic situation in China. Japan had invaded in 1937 and by 1942 controlled most of the coast, the major cities, and the critical railway lines. The Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to the interior, establishing their wartime capital at Chongqing. The only way to get supplies to China was over the hump, the dangerous air route over the Himalayas from India. Every pound of cargo was precious. Every weapon had to justify its weight in gold. The Japanese railway network was the spine of the occupation. Trains carried troops to the front lines, ammunition to forward bases, and food to the garrison cities. If the Chinese resistance could disrupt this network, they could impose significant costs on the Japanese war effort. But the railways were heavily guarded. Conventional sabotage required large quantities of explosives that could not be moved through Japanese-controlled territory. The guerrillas had the will to fight. What they lacked was the means. The importance of railways to Japanese operations in China cannot be overstated. Unlike in Europe, where the Germans had extensive road networks to supplement rail transport, Chinese infrastructure was primitive outside the major cities. The few paved highways that existed were inadequate for moving large military formations. Rivers provided some transportation capability, but they did not go everywhere the army needed to go. Railways were the only practical means of projecting power across the vast Chinese interior. The Japanese had seized control of China's rail network early in the war, recognizing its strategic importance. By 1942, they operated thousands of miles of track stretching from Manchuria in the north to Canton in the south. Trains ran on regular schedules, carrying everything from tanks and artillery to rice and medical supplies. Each disruption to this network created cascading problems. A single destroyed bridge could halt traffic on an entire line for days while repairs were made. Multiple simultaneous attacks could paralyze entire regions. Chinese guerrilla forces had attempted railway sabotage since the beginning of the occupation. In 1940, the Chinese Communist forces launched a major offensive in North China, destroying railways and a major coal mine. These operations demonstrated the vulnerability of Japanese supply lines, but also revealed the limitations of conventional sabotage. The attacks required large numbers of fighters and substantial quantities of explosives. Japanese retaliation was swift and brutal, with entire villages destroyed in punishment for suspected support of the resistance. What the OSS and SACO needed was a way to conduct sabotage without exposing guerrilla networks to detection and destruction. They needed to move explosives through Japanese-controlled territory without arousing suspicion. They needed a weapon that could hide in plain sight. The task landed on the desk of one of the most brilliant chemists in America. George Bogdan Kistiakowsky was a Ukrainian refugee who had fled the Russian Revolution, escaped through Turkey, and eventually earned his doctorate in physical chemistry from the University of Berlin. His journey to America had been anything but ordinary. Born in 1900 into an old Ukrainian Cossack family that was part of the intellectual elite in pre-revolutionary Russia, Kistiakowsky had joined the anti-communist White Army as a young man. When the White forces collapsed, he escaped on a commandeered French ship, making his way through Turkey and Yugoslavia before reaching Germany. At the University of Berlin, Kistiakowsky studied under Max Bodenstein, one of the world's leading experts in physical chemistry. His doctoral thesis examined the photochemical decomposition of chlorine monoxide and ozone. By 1926, he had emigrated to the United States, first joining Princeton University before moving to Harvard in 1930. There he built a reputation as one of the foremost experts on thermodynamics, spectroscopy, and chemical kinetics. His work on explosives began before America entered the war, when President Roosevelt created the National Defense Research Committee in 1940 to coordinate scientific efforts for national defense. Kistiakowsky was appointed to head the section responsible for explosives. When the National Defense Research Committee was absorbed into the Office of Scientific Research and Development in 1941, he continued his work, eventually becoming head of Division 8, responsible for explosives and propellants. His laboratory developed new formulations and studied the behavior of detonation waves. He was, in short, exactly the right person to solve an impossible problem. In late 1942, Kistiakowsky received an unusual request from the OSS. The request came through Stanley Lovell, the director of the OSS Research and Development Branch. Lovell was a renowned industrial chemist from Massachusetts who had been recruited into intelligence work by William Wild Bill Donovan, the founder of the OSS. When Donovan first met Lovell, he told him that he needed a modern-day Professor Moriarty, referring to the criminal mastermind from the Sherlock Holmes stories. Lovell accepted the challenge and assembled a team of scientists to develop what he called dirty tricks for use against the Axis powers. Lovell's team operated through Division 19 of the National Defense Research Committee, informally known as the Sandeman Club. Their projects ranged from exploding fountain pens to silent pistols to foul-smelling compounds designed to humiliate Japanese officers. No idea was too outlandish if it might help win the war. When the OSS identified the need for an explosive that could pass through Japanese checkpoints in China, Lovell turned to Kistiakowsky. The specifications were precise. They needed an explosive that could be disguised as ordinary flour and smuggled through Japanese checkpoints by Chinese guerrillas. The mixture had to be undetectable. It had to be safe to transport, and it had to be powerful enough to destroy military targets once activated. Kistiakowsky understood immediately that conventional explosives would not work. TNT was too dense and had a distinctive crystalline appearance. Dynamite was too unstable and smelled of nitroglycerin. RDX, while powerful, was also recognizable to trained inspectors. He needed something different, something that shared the physical properties of flour while retaining devastating explosive potential. The answer came from an unexpected source. HMX, also called octogen, was a powerful compound that had been identified during research into RDX production. Its name likely stood for high-melting explosive, though some chemists jokingly called it Her Majesty's explosive. What made HMX remarkable was its combination of properties. It was one of the most powerful conventional explosives ever synthesized, approximately 50% more powerful than TNT by weight. But unlike most high explosives, it was remarkably stable. It required significant heat or a detonator to explode. Impact alone would not set it off. Friction would not set it off. And critically for Kistiakowsky's purposes, cooking temperatures would not set it off. HMX came in a fine white powder that looked almost identical to wheat flour. When Kistiakowsky mixed it with regular baking flour, the resulting compound was virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. The texture was right. The color was right. The weight was right. Only close examination would reveal a slightly gritty quality, and even that was subtle enough to escape casual notice. But could it actually be baked? This was the crucial test. If the mixture exploded when heated, it would be useless for smuggling. Kistiakowsky conducted careful experiments, gradually increasing the temperature while monitoring the compound. The results exceeded his expectations. HMX remained stable at baking temperatures. The flour could be mixed with water, eggs, and milk. It could be kneaded into dough. It could be placed in an oven and baked into bread, muffins, or pancakes. The finished products looked completely normal and could even be eaten, though this was strongly discouraged. The stability of HMX at cooking temperatures was remarkable. Most high explosives become increasingly sensitive as they are heated. TNT melts at around 80 degrees Celsius and becomes more unstable as temperature rises. Nitroglycerin can detonate spontaneously when heated. But HMX has a melting point of approximately 280 degrees Celsius, well above normal baking temperatures, which rarely exceed 200 degrees. This meant guerrillas could bake the explosive flour without fear of accidental detonation. The baking process actually improved the product's effectiveness in some ways. Baked goods could be transported more easily than loose flour, which might spill or leak from containers. Bread and muffins looked even more innocent than sacks of flour. And the baked products could be stored for days without degradation, giving guerrillas more flexibility in timing their operations. The ratio settled upon was roughly 75% HMX to 25% flour, though some sources suggest the proportions varied depending on the intended use. This mixture provided enough explosive power to destroy significant targets while maintaining the appearance and handling characteristics of ordinary baking flour. The OSS named the product Aunt Jemima after the popular American pancake mix. The code name was both practical and whimsical. If anyone intercepted communications mentioning Aunt Jemima, they would likely assume it referred to actual food supplies rather than military ordnance. The product was packaged in ordinary flour sacks and prepared for shipment to China. Getting supplies into China presented its own challenges. The Japanese controlled the coast and most overland routes. The only reliable supply line was the hump, the treacherous air route over the Himalayan mountains from India. Every pound of cargo flown over the hump competed with fuel, ammunition, and other essential supplies. But the potential of Aunt Jemima justified the expense. Unlike conventional explosives, which required careful handling and obvious packaging, Aunt Jemima could be distributed through normal supply channels and carried by ordinary people. The Sino-American Cooperative Organization, known as SACO, served as the primary distribution network. This joint American and Chinese intelligence operation was established through an informal agreement in mid-1942 and formalized by treaty on April 15, 1943. On the Chinese side, SACO was commanded by General Dai Li, the feared head of Chiang Kai-shek's secret police and intelligence apparatus. On the American side, the commander was Captain Milton Miles of the United States Navy, a colorful officer who had been sent to China shortly after Pearl Harbor to establish intelligence and weather services. Miles and Dai Li made an unlikely partnership. Dai Li was a shadowy figure who trusted few people, especially foreigners. Miles was a brash American who insisted on doing things the Chinese way rather than imposing American methods. Somehow they made it work. When Chiang Kai-shek decreed that any agreement with the Americans would be valid only between Miles and Dai Li personally, Miles accepted the arrangement, understanding that Chinese politics required Chinese solutions. SACO maintained its headquarters at a secret base called Happy Valley, located about 8 miles west of Chongqing in the Yangtze River Basin. The name was an ironic translation of the Chinese place name. In reality, Happy Valley was a sprawling complex of training facilities, radio stations, and administrative buildings carved into the mountains. The main school at Happy Valley would ultimately graduate 15,000 field-ready guerrilla fighters skilled in demolition, radio interception, photography, hand-to-hand combat, and other techniques essential to unconventional warfare. The site had been chosen for practical reasons. It was cooler and less humid than Chongqing, with access to enough water for the hundreds of men who trained there. Security was paramount. Miles established a culture of informality that put Americans and Chinese on equal footing. "We hoisted no flag," he later wrote. "We sounded no calls. We practiced no salutes and wore what was handy. It was a place to forget spit and polish, but never cleanliness, to forget rank, but not discipline." From Happy Valley, American advisors worked with Chinese guerrilla forces to plan and execute sabotage operations throughout occupied China. The training curriculum included small arms, grenades, demolition, scouting and patrol, ambush, close-range fighting, and teamwork in the field. Camps near water included instruction in coast watching and ship identification. Those near air routes added aircraft recognition. Urban warfare specialists learned street fighting techniques, and all of them learned how to use Aunt Jemima. The first shipments of Aunt Jemima arrived in China in 1943. American demolition experts began training Chinese guerrillas in its use. The procedure was straightforward. The explosive flour could be transported through Japanese checkpoints without arousing suspicion. If guards demanded proof that the powder was harmless, the carrier could actually bake and eat a portion of it. Once past the checkpoint, the flour could be molded around a detonator and placed against the target. A timer or fuse would trigger the explosion, and the guerrilla would be long gone before the blast. One American veteran of the campaign, Frank Gleason, served as an advisor and demolition expert in China. In an oral history interview conducted decades after the war, he described demonstrating the product to his commanding officer. "In China, we made muffins from the stuff," he recalled. "I wanted to show Major Miles how you could bake Aunt Jemima into muffins, put a blasting cap into it, and blow something up. It looks like regular flour, but if you look carefully at a little piece, you would see it was gritty, unlike flour." Gleason continued with a story that illustrated both the product's convincing appearance and its dangers. "It could make bread, so I told this Chinese cook at Happy Valley to make some muffins out of the explosive flour. I said, 'Do not eat those muffins. They are poison. Do not eat them. You should have seen them when they came out of the oven. They were gorgeous.' The cook thought to himself, 'Those damn Americans just want those muffins for themselves.' He violated what I told him, and he ate one." The early formulation of Aunt Jemima caused severe gastrointestinal distress when consumed. The cook became violently ill but survived. Later refinements reduced the toxicity, making the product safer to eat in small quantities for demonstration purposes. However, regular consumption was never recommended. The operational use of Aunt Jemima expanded rapidly throughout 1943 and 1944. Chinese guerrilla units received training in demolition techniques and began conducting systematic attacks on Japanese infrastructure. Railways were the primary target. Japan's military strategy in China depended on moving troops and supplies by rail. Every destroyed bridge, every wrecked locomotive, every damaged section of track forced the Japanese to divert resources from the front lines to repairs and security. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let us examine how Aunt Jemima was used in the field. The operational employment of Aunt Jemima followed carefully developed procedures. Before any mission, guerrillas would receive specific training in handling the explosive flour, setting detonators, and calculating the amounts needed for different targets. American advisors emphasized that the product was stable under normal conditions, but would explode with devastating force when properly initiated. There was no room for error. Transportation was the first challenge. Guerrillas would carry the explosive flour in ordinary sacks, often mixed with actual flour to provide an additional layer of deception. They traveled on foot, by bicycle, or in carts, blending with the thousands of peasants and merchants who moved through Japanese-occupied territory every day. The key was to appear completely unremarkable. Any sign of nervousness or unusual behavior could attract attention from guards who were trained to watch for resistance fighters. Japanese checkpoints varied in their thoroughness. Some performed only cursory inspections, waving through travelers with barely a glance. Others were more rigorous, searching bags and questioning travelers about their destinations and purposes. The most dangerous checkpoints required demonstrations that carried goods were genuine. It was for these situations that the edible nature of Aunt Jemima proved invaluable. When a guard demanded proof that flour was actually flour, the guerrilla could mix a small portion with water and bake it over a fire. The resulting bread or pancake was obviously real food. In extreme cases, the guerrilla could eat a portion to prove it was harmless. This demonstration satisfied even the most suspicious guards. No one imagined that the same flour being consumed as food could also destroy a bridge. The beauty of the explosive flour lay in its versatility. Guerrillas could transport it openly through areas under Japanese control. They could store it in villages without arousing suspicion. They could prepare it for use at the last possible moment, reducing the risk of discovery. And they could deny any knowledge of its true nature if questioned. What checkpoint guard would suspect that the flour being used to bake bread for a peasant family was actually powerful enough to destroy a military installation? Railway bridges received special attention. A single destroyed bridge could halt rail traffic for days or weeks while repairs were completed. Guerrillas would approach at night, mold the explosive flour around key structural supports, attach a detonator with a timed fuse, and withdraw. When the explosion occurred, they were already miles away, blending back into the civilian population. The SACO maintained detailed records of operations, though many were classified or destroyed after the war. What we know is impressive. According to official reports, between June 1944 and July 1945 alone, SACO trained guerrillas destroyed 209 bridges, 84 locomotives, and 141 ships and rivercraft. They killed over 23,000 Japanese soldiers and wounded thousands more during this period. While not all of these operations used Aunt Jemima, the explosive flour contributed significantly to the sabotage campaign. The statistics tell only part of the story. Each destroyed bridge represented days or weeks of disrupted rail traffic. Each wrecked locomotive meant supplies that never reached the front lines. The cumulative effect was substantial. Japanese commanders were forced to divert troops from combat operations to guard duty. Engineers who should have been building fortifications were instead repairing sabotaged infrastructure. The occupation became more expensive and more difficult to maintain. One SACO unit, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Halperin at Unit 6 in Fujian Province, trained 2,500 Chinese guerrillas and directed operations that killed 1,300 enemy troops and destroyed tons of shipping. Another group, the Yangtze Raiders, penetrated deep behind Japanese lines with just 36 Americans and Chinese, passing through a 100,000-man Japanese army to strike at supply lines wherever they were weakest. From July through September 1944, the Raiders reported killing 967 Japanese soldiers while losing only 14 of their own men. The guerrillas developed creative techniques for using Aunt Jemima against different targets. For railway bridges, they would mold the explosive flour around structural supports, using the product's plasticity to conform to irregular shapes. For locomotives, they would place charges beneath the boiler or against the driving wheels. For warehouses and depots, they would conceal the explosive inside ordinary containers, timing the detonation to cause maximum confusion. The versatility of the product allowed each operation to be tailored to specific circumstances. The total quantity of Aunt Jemima used in China reportedly reached approximately 15 tons over the course of the war. This may sound modest compared to the thousands of tons of conventional explosives used in other theaters, but 15 tons of a material that could be smuggled through enemy checkpoints in plain sight represented an extraordinary force multiplier. Every pound that reached its target did so because the Japanese never suspected what it really was. The psychological impact on Japanese occupation forces was substantial, though difficult to quantify. Guards at checkpoints began to realize that they could never be certain what was passing through their inspections. The harmless flour carried by a peasant might actually be a weapon capable of destroying a bridge. The innocent-looking merchant might actually be a trained saboteur. This uncertainty consumed resources and attention. More guards were needed, more inspections were conducted. More time was wasted searching for threats that could not be identified. The concept of edible explosives was not unique to the Americans. British Special Operations Executive developed similar compounds for use in Europe. But the scale and success of the Aunt Jemima program in China made it the most significant deployment of disguised explosives during the war. Let us now compare Aunt Jemima to other sabotage explosives available during World War II. The comparison reveals just how unique this product was. Conventional TNT was powerful and reliable, but immediately recognizable. It had a distinctive yellow color and crystalline structure. No one would mistake it for flour or any other harmless substance. TNT had been the standard military explosive since World War I, but its appearance made it useless for covert operations requiring disguise. Guards at Japanese checkpoints were trained to recognize TNT on sight. RDX was more powerful than TNT, approximately 1.5 times as strong by weight, and formed the basis for plastic explosives like Composition C. The British and Americans used RDX extensively for conventional demolition operations. However, plastic explosives had their own distinctive appearance and smell. They could be molded into various shapes, but could not be disguised as food products. A block of Composition C would be immediately identified by any competent inspector. The British Special Operations Executive developed several camouflaged explosives for use in occupied Europe, including coal bombs and explosive animal droppings. These devices were designed to be scattered in areas where the enemy might pick them up, such as coal bins or roads. However, they could not be mass-produced or distributed through normal supply channels. They also could not survive the kind of close inspection that Aunt Jemima could withstand. A guard might examine a piece of coal closely, but no one would bake and eat it. Some sources mention that the American high-standard Model D, a suppressed pistol used by the OSS, was also employed in China. However, this weapon served a completely different purpose. The silent pistol was designed for targeted assassinations, not infrastructure sabotage. It could not destroy a bridge or wreck a locomotive. The two weapons complemented each other, with Aunt Jemima providing demolition capability while silent firearms enabled individual operations. What made Aunt Jemima unique was its ability to function as actual food while retaining explosive capability. This was not merely camouflage. The product actually behaved like flour in every normal circumstance. It could be baked, cooked, and consumed. Only when deliberately initiated with a detonator would it reveal its true nature. No other explosive in the arsenal of any nation possessed this combination of characteristics. The chemistry that made this possible was both elegant and demanding. HMX has a melting point well above normal baking temperatures which rarely exceed 200 degrees. This meant the compound would not decompose or detonate during cooking. However, HMX is also extremely sensitive to shock when combined with a detonator. The sharp pulse of a blasting cap would initiate a detonation wave that propagated through the entire mass of explosive at velocities approaching 9,000 meters per second. The explosive power of HMX derives from its molecular structure. It consists of an 8-membered ring of alternating carbon and nitrogen atoms with a nitro group attached to each nitrogen. When detonated, this structure releases enormous energy as the molecule rapidly converts to gases. The detonation pressure exceeds 39 gigapascals, making HMX one of the most brisant or shattering conventional explosives known. 1 pound of the Aunt Jemima mixture contained enough explosive force to sever a steel railway rail or blow a significant hole in a concrete structure. Larger quantities could destroy bridges, collapse tunnels, or wreck locomotives. The product was particularly effective against the wooden trestle bridges common in rural China, where a relatively small charge placed at a critical structural point could bring down an entire span. There were limitations, of course. Aunt Jemima required a proper detonator to function. Without a blasting cap or other initiating device, the flour would simply sit inert regardless of what was done to it. This meant that guerrillas still needed access to detonators, which were harder to disguise than the explosive itself. Timing fuses and other accessories also had to be smuggled separately. The Japanese understood that detonators were the key to any explosive device and focused considerable attention on preventing them from reaching resistance fighters. The product also had a finite shelf life. Over time, the HMX could separate from the flour or degrade in humid conditions. China's subtropical climate was particularly challenging, with high humidity during the summer months that could affect the stability of the he mixture. Proper storage in sealed containers was important to maintain effectiveness. Guerrillas learned to use older stocks first and to protect newer supplies from moisture. Training was essential. While Aunt Jemima was safer to handle than most explosives, improper use could still result in accidents. Guerrillas had to learn the correct procedures for attaching detonators, calculating charge sizes, and placing explosives for maximum effect. They also had to understand the limitations of the product. Aunt Jemima was highly effective against wooden and masonry structures, but less effective against reinforced concrete or thick steel. Choosing the right targets was crucial to achieving meaningful results, and while the refined formulation was less toxic than the original, consuming large quantities was still inadvisable. Some guerrillas reportedly experienced digestive problems after eating demonstration portions of the product. The HMX component passed through the body without detonating, but it could cause irritation to the digestive tract. Medical support for guerrilla units was limited, making any health issue potentially serious. Despite these limitations, Aunt Jemima proved remarkably successful. According to available records, the Japanese never discovered the true nature of the explosive flour during the entire war. Every shipment that made it into China was either used against targets or consumed as food during times of scarcity. The secret remained intact until well after the war ended. The legacy of Aunt Jemima extended beyond World War II. The concept of edible explosives influenced subsequent developments in military chemistry. The principle that an explosive could be disguised as an ordinary substance, capable of passing inspection and even functional testing, opened new possibilities for covert operations. Modern intelligence agencies have continued to develop camouflaged munitions, though the specific formulations remain classified. The success of Aunt Jemima also demonstrated the value of combining scientific expertise with operational requirements. Kistiakowsky did not simply invent an explosive. He solved a specific problem defined by field operatives who understood what was needed to conduct effective sabotage in occupied territory. This collaboration between laboratory and battlefield became a model for subsequent weapons development programs. HMX itself went on to become one of the most important military explosives of the modern era. After the war, it was used in nuclear weapon triggers, missile warheads, and advanced munitions. The same stability that made it suitable for Aunt Jemima made it ideal for applications requiring precise, reliable detonation under controlled conditions. Today, HMX remains in military inventories around the world, though it has been supplemented by newer compounds with even greater performance. George Kistiakowsky went on to even greater achievements after the war. In 1944, he joined the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, where he led the team that developed the explosive lenses for the implosion-type atomic bomb. The same expertise in explosive chemistry that created Aunt Jemima contributed to the most destructive weapon in history. After the war, Kistiakowsky became science advisor to President Eisenhower and later advocated for nuclear arms control. He died in 1982. Remembered both as a brilliant scientist and a man deeply concerned about the weapons he had helped create. The OSS was dissolved after the war, but its legacy lived on in the Central Intelligence Agency. The techniques developed for supporting Chinese guerrillas informed subsequent covert operations around the world. The institutional knowledge accumulated by men like Lovell and Gleason became the foundation for America's post-war intelligence capabilities. When the Cold War began, the lessons of unconventional warfare learned in China proved valuable once again. SACO itself was officially dissolved in 1946 after the departure of Naval Group China. However, some SACO-trained guerrillas continued fighting, this time against the Chinese communists in the civil war that followed Japan's surrender. The partnership between Miles and Dai Li ended tragically when Dai Li died in a plane crash in March 1946. Miles, who had wanted to attend the funeral of his wartime partner, was denied permission by General George Marshall, who was attempting to mediate between the nationalists and communists, and feared that an American military representative at a nationalist leader's funeral would undermine his efforts. Frank Gleason, the demolition expert who baked explosive muffins at Happy Valley, went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam before retiring as a colonel. In 2018, at age 97, he received the Congressional Gold Medal for his wartime service, along with other surviving OSS veterans. The guerrillas who carried Aunt Jemima through Japanese checkpoints are largely forgotten by history. They were peasants, merchants, and laborers who risked execution to carry what appeared to be ordinary flour, but was actually a weapon of war. Many were caught and killed by the Japanese for other suspected crimes. Some survived to see China's liberation, only to be consumed by the civil war that followed. Their contributions to the Allied victory remain one of the lesser-known stories of World War II. These anonymous heroes came from all walks of life. Some were professional soldiers who had been trained at Happy Valley and other SACO camps. Others were ordinary civilians who agreed to carry supplies for the resistance without fully understanding what they were transporting. Women and children were sometimes used as couriers because they were less likely to be searched thoroughly at checkpoints. The Japanese, despite their suspicions, never fully appreciated how deeply the resistance had penetrated the civilian population. The risks these couriers faced were enormous. Japanese military police and their Chinese collaborators maintained extensive informant networks throughout occupied territory. Anyone suspected of aiding the resistance faced torture and execution. Entire families could be punished for the actions of one member. Yet thousands of Chinese chose to participate in the sabotage campaign, motivated by patriotism, hatred of the occupiers, or simply the desire to strike back against an enemy that had brought such suffering to their country. Some of the couriers became skilled at their work, making multiple trips through Japanese lines over months or years. They learned which checkpoints were more lax, which guards could be bribed, and which routes offered the best chances of avoiding detection. They developed cover stories and practiced their behavior until they could pass as ordinary travelers without any sign of nervousness. These techniques, refined through dangerous experience, were passed on to new recruits in an informal school of espionage. What makes the Aunt Jemima story remarkable is not just its ingenuity, but its success. In an era of massive bombing raids and armored warfare, a simple mixture of flour and explosive powder made a measurable difference in the outcome of the war. It demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the most powerful, but the most unexpected. The Japanese spent enormous resources guarding against threats they could see while overlooking the danger that passed through their checkpoints, disguised as breakfast. The 15 tons of Aunt Jemima used in China represented perhaps the most efficient explosive deployment of the entire war. Every pound reached its target precisely because it did not look like a weapon. Every bridge destroyed, every train wrecked, every supply depot demolished came not from massive bombardment but from a substance that looked, felt, and even tasted like ordinary baking flour. The next time you see a bag of flour on a store shelf, consider that during the darkest days of World War II, identical bags carried one of the most powerful explosives ever created. They passed through enemy checkpoints. They sat in peasant kitchens. They were baked into bread and muffins that came out of the oven looking gorgeous, as Frank Gleason put it. And when the time was right, they exploded with enough force to change the course of history. In the end, Aunt Jemima proved that the most dangerous weapon is often the one hiding in plain sight. According to all available accounts, the Japanese never caught a single shipment. They never identified the substance. They never realized that the key to American sabotage success was passing through their inspection stations every day, carried by farmers and merchants who smiled and bowed while concealing enough explosive power to destroy everything the occupation had built. That is the story of the American edible flower that blew up Japanese trains across China. A story of chemistry and courage, disguise and deception, and the remarkable ingenuity of men and women who found a way to fight back against overwhelming odds using nothing more than what appeared to be a sack of flour.